Hi, counselors, and welcome to this presentation on core function number 9, client education. So client education is straightforward as far as the core function and the global criteria. Very simply, it's the provision of information to individuals and groups concerning alcohol and other drug abuse and the available services and resources. Global criteria, there's only two: present alcohol and other drug use abuse information to the client through formal and informal processes. Secondly, present information about available alcohol and other drug services and resources. That's pretty much it. Again, this one is easy. It's easy to memorize. However, in my experience, this covers a lot of ground. Take a moment and think about the information you're being tasked to provide. Looking at the straight core function is the provision of information to individuals and groups concerning alcohol and other drug abuse and the available services and resources. This information includes the physical effects of drugs, the psychological effects, interactions with other drugs and medications, overdose symptoms, intoxication symptoms, withdrawal symptoms, applicable federal, state, and local laws, and the legal effects. There's a lot of ground to cover on this core function. So let's dial down into the global criteria, beginning with present relevant alcohol and other drug abuse information to the client through formal and/or informal processes. Education can be provided in a bunch of ways, and these are all exam-worthy examples. First, you have the obvious, which is formal didactic classes using reading materials, videos, and lectures. Now, these can be small groups, they can be large groups, they can even be family settings. And it can also include community resources such as schools, employers, probation departments, jails, etc. So you're providing relevant, up-to-date information on alcohol and other drugs of abuse. You also want to know all the information available about self-help groups in the community that you serve, including Alcoholics Anonymous meeting schedules, Narcotics Anonymous, Al-Anon for family members, Alateen for children, Smart Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, and if you're lucky enough to live in an area with Dharma Recovery, it has a Buddhist meditation based way of getting recovery. So you want to have information on that. You're also going to want to have information on other treatment centers, programs, shelters, housing, food banks, available inpatient treatment that's in the area, knowing the available intensive outpatient, and knowing where the detox centers are. So it's a lot of information that, according to this core function, you're responsible to convey to groups and the community. Now, the education can take place in a few different ways. One way can be informally, like when you're having a discussion with an individual where you're just talking. You want to share the information you have without lecturing, right? Without hitting them over the head with it, but you want to be pretty confident when you're meeting people one-on-one. And this is true. Write this one down. It's not on the exam. This is just a truism. A counselor is only as good as his or her resources. I'm sure you've seen people at your facility. They have the binder, the master binder is like this thick and weighs 50 pounds, that has every single possible resource you can imagine. That's a counselor that's operating at peak client education. And by the way, clients aren't always just the counselor. Your client can be other facilities. Your client can be lawyers. Your client can be probation departments. So you're only as good as the resources that you have. Now, in a lot of places, this kind of falls into case managers or peer support, but it is still an essential core function for substance abuse counselors. And the advent of streaming and YouTube has significantly increased access, as well as social media. So you can steer them in the right direction for Facebook groups. You can steer them in the right direction of other creators. Like Put the Shovel Down is my number one. When I have people that are involved in relationship issues, I go straight to Put the Shovel Down. Amber tends to have really top-notch content, and I always have her in my toolbox when it comes to client education and providing people other resources. Now, in client education, and again, the exam is going to test you on this, you want to integrate trauma-informed and first-person language. You want to communicate in ways that don't trigger people, that don't make them feel defensive. You're not going, well, if you had listened to me, you'd go to AA. It's more like, hey, if you're struggling with this, you might want to consider AA, where you can get a sober support network. There's different ways of putting things. You want to provide resources that reflect the client's culture, literacy, and access, especially if you're dealing with different ethnic populations. You want to have knowledge of their religious centers, um, places where they can go and exchange information. You want to know about drop-in centers that generally don't cost any money. So, and for LGBTQ clients, there are drop-in centers all over the country. So you want to know what those are. You want to use formal methods, which is generally classes and groups, and informal methods, which tend to be regular sessions or even just weekly check-ins. Be sure to include digital resources such as 988, which is the helpline. You want to use telehealth and let them know about recovery apps that are out there so they can have daily contact with information. There's a few great apps out there centered around cognitive behavioral and relapse prevention. You definitely want to know about those. You want to always emphasize the idea of informed choice and self-directed recovery, and always keep in mind informed consent. You want them to buy into what you're suggesting. You want to explain why you're suggesting it and negotiate with them and work with them to get them to agree to at least give it a shot. With the new exam and with the new NADAC Code of Ethics, there's increased emphasis on harm reduction strategies and medication that can include naloxone and Narcan, needle exchanges, safe use plans, things like that. You want to be able to explain medication-assisted treatment as evidence-based care. And we do have medically assisted treatment primarily for alcohol and for opioids. So you want to have that in your hip pocket and in your knowledge base when you're talking to people, both formally and informally. You want to teach coping skills. You want to be able to teach them relapse warning signs. And in a lot of cases, you're going to want to have a safety plan, a crisis response plan. And generally, you want to encourage, but not mandate, just encourage active participation in recovery programs, again, such as AA, NA, Smart Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, and anything else you have in your neck of the woods. The next global criteria is present information about available alcohol and other drug services and resources. This is where you can demonstrate on the exam and with your patient that your awareness of key resources in the community. Again, it feels repetitive, but 12-step meetings, smart recovery meetings, anything you have in your area, you're going to want to be able to provide resources for family members, such as Al-Anon, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and Alateen. You also have Overeaters Anonymous for people who have eating disorders. You want to be able to understand and refer people to alternatives to 12-step recovery, such as Dharma or smart recovery. You want to know where all the drop-in centers are. You want to know where shelters and housing assistance can be found. You want to know where the food banks are. And you also want to be aware of veterans resources, especially if you live in an area with a high veteran population. Now, here's where the ethics comes in. And I know people want to have one go-to thing for ethics, but ethics definitely applies in this and many other of the core functions. You want to always maintain client confidentiality, which is updated in NADAC in Principle 7. You also want to be following all HIPAA and 42 CFR guidelines. For those of us counselors who are in recovery, we want to be on guard from imposing our personal recovery ideology. What we experience in our recovery journey, it might reflect what they're going through, and it might help you relate to them on certain levels, but it can also turn people off. So be aware of your biases and work with your clinical supervisor and your colleagues to kind of make certain that you're not crossing that line. You want to always use fact-based information from recognized resources, such as the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, also known as NIDA. You want to always have informed consent and make certain that it's voluntary participation in these programs and resources. Finally, you want to keep in mind that education is not lecturing, it's collaboration. So, what I'm doing here, I'm basically doing all the talking. This is kind of a lecture. I try to make it as informal as possible. But what I'm doing right here is lecturing. When you're with people or small groups or your clients or whoever, you don't want to be lecturing them. You want to be collaborating. You want to ask open-ended questions, ask them to narrow down what it is, help narrow down what it is they're looking for, and then work with them to identify resources. Always meet the client where they're at. Beware of having lofty expectations. In the case of your clients and patients, keep in mind the stages of change. If they're in a pre-contemplation mindset, you might not want to overwhelm them with a whole bunch of stuff as if they're in the maintenance phase. Always use credible resources and use plain language. And as always, support autonomy, choice, and ongoing learning. So that's it for Core Function 9. It's just that it pretty much contains everything that you've ever learned. You're going to use what you know about withdrawal symptoms. You're going to use what you know about the client and about your own education in every core function from screening up until this one. It's a lot of information to know. So if you're kind of confused on where does this core function come into play, well, it comes into play on just about everything you're going to do as a substance abuse counselor. As always, if you have questions, you can email me directly at LeeBella-LLC@gmail.com. I'll have my Psychology Today link in the description. And if you want one-on-one coaching, you can contact me again through our email, LeeBella-LLC@gmail.com, and we can work out an agreement so I can provide you coaching. This whole thing is just designed to give you the best chance to pass the exam that you can possibly have. So until Core Function 10, this is Scott Spiers from LeeBella Counseling and Supervision saying, hey, see you next time. Bye.